Presented here by Leila Hock. We partner with Diversity Lab to bring us really the best of the best in what is happening in diversity, and more importantly, real life examples of how inclusion is helping to drive results. And so I will let Monica and Malaika take it away, and thank you both for doing this, and we appreciate all of what you're sharing with us today.
Thank you, Joan. And I'm going to change the settings here. Okay. Well, hello. I'm really glad to be here. As Joan said, this is the ChIPs DEIB webinar series, and we are featuring the 5 firms that were recognized at the ChIPs Honor Roll in person in San Francisco at our Global Summit last October. And so it's really fabulous to be here with Malaika Lindo. Malaika is Morgan Lewis's, she runs Morgan Lewis's global diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and works alongside senior leadership, engagement, and talent teams to create a workplace that is as diverse and inclusive as possible, consistent with the firm's fundamental values. And I've had the pleasure to learn more about what goes into making all of that happen. I know, having worked in the legal industry for a really long time, how challenging it has been and how much progress you and your team have made. So I'm really glad to have you here. The ChIPs Honor Roll is a joint initiative, as Joan said, between ChIPs and Diversity Lab. Selections are based on findings from Diversity Lab's Inclusion Blueprint, which provides diversity benchmarks of historically underrepresented groups, female lawyers, underrepresented racial ethnic lawyers, LGBTQ+ lawyers, and new this year in the Honor Roll report was lawyers with disabilities. And that's where Morgan Lewis made a great effort and showed that they could show up across all layers of diversity in law firm leadership and across practice groups, including IP. The Inclusion Blueprint also includes inclusion efforts for law firms to adopt to ensure their lawyers have fair and equal access to compensation, because we've got to get paid, right? Leadership roles and other critical career enhancing opportunities. And you can find out more at the ChIPs Honor Roll report. The link was put in the chat, and we'll add it again in case anyone new joining missed it. So with all that, welcome, Malaika. It's so great to see you here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate the opportunity to kind of peel the onion back just a little bit to talk about how we approach diversity and inclusion here at the firm. But also just, it's always great to kind of be asked, as someone who's in this position, I'm sure that there are several others who are in the space of diversity and inclusion, kind of what you think, and globally, how does this all fit together? Because while I think these surveys and the awards give a snapshot at one point in time, where we are and what we've been up to, I think that the sentiments and the intention behind all of the things we're doing kind of gives folks a glimpse into how we are really trying to strategize around how we look at things generally around talent and engagement, but also, how D&I fits into that. And so I welcome these discussions, because I do think that we really do learn from one another, kind of best practices, and as well as the challenges that we all kind of face, so that we can really have some thought leadership around this space, and so that folks aren't spinning their wheels. If I've done it before and I can be helpful in any kind of way, I'm happy to share.
I love that. It's really about making the entire legal industry better for everyone, lifting everyone up. There's a sense of abundance. This word is so powerful for me, that when we all believe that there's enough for everyone, we can all do better together.
Yes, absolutely. It's funny. I just, my daughter, who is 9, is in the 3rd grade, and she's learning how to navigate friendships. And I share with her all the time that, in the school setting, we are inclusive, which means that you believe that there's an abundance, your friendship is abundant, and there's no need to be exclusive. And these are the folks that you will, work with, they will be your classmates. You can't not have them as your classmates. So how do we create relationships that center schoolwork? I really do think that, I mean, I'm sure she's just like, I don't know what you're talking about. I just want to play with Caroline. But, that's kind of the approach that we have, right? Because you're trying to figure out, we've centered the workplace and that experience. How do we develop relationships that allow for everyone the opportunity to thrive? And that's ultimately what we're all trying to do. And inclusion and being inclusive is kind of the way we get there.
Yeah, I love that. The other thing I really love about the ChIPs Honor Roll partnership with Diversity Lab is it moves beyond the numbers of diversity to this point of inclusion, because I have been in law firms where I haven't felt like I belonged there. I have heard things where I know others have not felt they belonged there. And so it gets to this point where actually people are able to show up and do their best work because they feel good being in the workplace.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, one of the things, and I've shared this, if you've seen me, speak anywhere, I am a huge fan of the Mansfield Rule. And I think of that as the inclusive practice for D&I professionals. And what I mean by that is that what that survey measures is, or what that survey aims to do, is to get your diversity and inclusion folks centered or a part of the conversation, and all of these aspects that touch the talent at the organization all the way through leadership. Administrators in law firms are already involved typically, but sometimes we think of diversity and inclusion as being separate and apart from your recruiting efforts. It's this thing that we do in addition to, right? So, we have diversity recruiting, or we think about, recruiting for diversity in addition to our recruiting strategy. We think of diversity and inclusion in addition to our talent models, talent engagement or a talent learning strategy. And what the Mansfield Rule tried to do is to say, hey, these things need to be embedded, but the only way you do that is to get the people in the room. And so this, what the ChIPs survey does in the inclusion blueprint, it's kind of the evolution of thinking about, okay, firm-wide, now that you've kind of got these people in the room and we're beginning to measure, which is fantastic, that's step one. What are we doing with those measurements, right? What are you finding? What are you seeing? What now are you able to find? What opportunities and vulnerabilities that are you able to see that you can start to plug? And asking those questions allows for us to think more broadly and more generally, I think, about what our approaches are. Because oftentimes you could be, especially when you're doing very well, you can be just working and moving through day to day, not really thinking about what is the impact of this system that we put in, this process that we put in place, this new department that we've established. What are the impacts to D&I as a result of some of the things that we're doing? And then thinking about that firm-wide, but then also looking at the practice group. And that is, I think, where we've had a lot of fun, I think, in my space, is moving beyond kind of the firm-wide strategy and getting closer to the practice group. And this allows for us to reflect some of the work we've done as a result of that.
Malaika, I'm getting chills. This is so powerful. And as you were saying that, I was thinking exactly this, right? What is that impact to that one person and their health and well-being and happiness on a daily basis? Have you done any qualitative assessments or these small group circles to kind of find out how does this actually impact one person and their livelihood?
Yeah. So we have been, the department that diversity and inclusion actually falls under is titled engagement. So we have attorney talent and engagement. And I and my colleagues who are head of professional development and recruiting report into the chief of engagement. And that's really purposeful. Jamie McKeon, I think, the chair of the firm, I think having her own personal experiences around what made her successful, the relationships she's built, the way in which she saw, and she speaks of this often, how she was developed, the models that she was given, the mentors that she had. She didn't kind of leave it to chance that everyone would find or have the same experience. And so we are structured in a way that really does focus on how is the talent engaged at various aspects of their career here. And so engagement is focused on that. And within engagement, you've got recruiting, professional development, you've got diversity and inclusion, well-being, and in community engagement, and pro bono. And that may feel like a lot, but if you think about it, it's it is what touches what each attorney will truly like walk through in order for them to be really fully engaged at the firm. And so we're all, together thinking about how are we making sure folks are developed, how are we making sure that everyone is thriving, and what are beyond just their client work, what are other things that will make people be connected to themselves, but also connected to their colleagues and connected to their communities. Because ultimately, that's where well-being starts to come into place, right? Are you connected to the work that you're doing in a way that allows for you to find whatever balance it is for yourself that is required? And that's not going to look the same for everyone. And so we're really purposeful about that. And our engagement team measures throughout, associate engagement. We do surveys in-house. For us, we have upward feedback for our partners that the associates do. And of course, we're constantly doing pulse surveys here internally as well, just to gauge what does it look like. And in all of those surveys, again, if you don't think of diversity and inclusion as separate and apart, it's embedded, right? So the questions around mentoring, around how people are feeling included, or do they feel that they belong? And you get around those questions, being able to do that when, there's not a separate survey that does that, right? We make sure that that's actually incorporated in the practice of what we're doing generally when it comes to engagement.
How have you found engagement and connection shift through COVID? And how have your efforts evolved to accommodate and that in those transitions of how we work?
Yeah, I actually joined the firm remotely. So I joined in 2021, early 2021, and I was pleasantly surprised to see how connected, once the firm went remote, it was a staying connected series. They did efforts, whether it was through pro bono, well-being, several well-being efforts to keep us connected. Everything from walking challenges, and people were super active where they, took pictures of themselves walking, and we used all of the platforms, all the virtual platforms we could to make sure that people were connected. Thinking about our mentoring programs and making sure that they were activated in a way that was conducive to the virtual space. And just like everyone, we struggled to to keep our arms around everyone, but there was a concerted structural effort to have things in place that people could tap into. Our lawyer networks became very active, which are our affinity groups, to make sure that there was space for people to come together. During the pandemic, or during our remote period, we also put together Mobilizing for Equality after the murder of Jamie and Grace Bates, the head of LEPG here, our labor and employment group here, actually came together because there was so much energy around it, and we were connected in other spaces. And they essentially came up with a new department. At first, it might have felt like an initiative, but it is something that is longstanding now, and it's going to continue here. And it's essentially 14 working groups working on everything from pro bono matters to legislative reform, to community engagement and volunteerism around racial equity, and looking at racial justice issues specifically and having people get connected through that. I don't think that works if your folks first aren't already connected. We had, over 1,000 volunteers, and it's a big thing that we're managing. Wow. But it doesn't work if people don't see that through line kind of reflected in the structure of the firm. So our community engagement, pro bono, things that we do in terms of professional development, we're already connected under engagement. And so this is an extension that's just specific when it comes to racial equity. Those are the type of things that I think come together when folks are connected, because they know that they can go and express, themselves and contribute and add value in spaces that, of course, are related to the firm and our client work, but are also related to our communities and experiences that they're having. And I think that that's so important when we're thinking about well-being in particular, and being connected and making sure that those efforts that you need to be able, that you want to express, or the topics that may be challenging to some of our underrepresented communities, have spaces to actually talk about it and to do something if they choose to.
It's almost like you're creating the workplace where people want to show up and thrive and feel good, because you're saying these are the values that matter and our actions are aligned with our values. And if you don't believe that this matters, maybe there's another place for you to work.
I mean, I think, I think everyone, I've worked at several firms, and several firms have really put forth their values, right? And they've, we value X. And I think that first, we should have values that are clear, right? That folks, when they come into the organization, can recognize and align themselves with. But not only that, I think, what's really hard is to put the structures in place that actually then reflect the values. It's one thing to have those sentiments individually, and that's, I think, what's hard about diversity and inclusion, right? It's hearts and minds, but it's also, structural. It's also process. It's also what the systems are doing. The things that are happening that, we may not just be aware of in the background because we've set something up, we've incentivized behaviors that we don't even realize we've done. So being able to kind of, stating the values, having leaders that reflect those values, that's hearts and minds. That's what's going to make that a connection. But you've got to have investment, the resources, the structures in place in order to carry that through. And we've, I am always saying I'm pleasantly surprised. I recognized it in the structure here at the firm. I joined specifically because I knew D&I was actually part of the engagement team, but to actually see it happening is something that I'm always really grateful for. And it's easier to do this work when you can point to systems and structures that can help support the sentiments that we're trying to make. And that's ultimately how we've put together some of our IP mentoring programs and some of the sponsorship programs that we talked about in our submission. We're able to do that because the structures are in place. And that is, I think, a really key component to a lot of the work that we do.
I want to invite Leila Hock to join us. Just like you just said, the structures that you put in place to become one of only 2 firms to be honored for the ChIPs and Diversity Lab Excellence for All, including the new category that was added this year in disability. And I'd love to hear what that looks like for the firm overall and for the IP group. So see if we can get Leila Hock in to join. And then Malaika, maybe you can share with us what you did specifically to receive this honor.
So I will say, I was really happy. Rachel Hutt, who's the manager of our client engagement, diversity and inclusion efforts, has been doing a lot of this work in terms of helping us complete industry surveys. And we often say that we measure progress. So we are always looking back to say, like, okay, what did we do last year? And she was ecstatic when we saw kind of the results this year, and to see that our numbers have really been growing in terms of underrepresentation in certain aspects. And one of the things that we did that I think was key, and it started before I arrived, which was a rehaul of our voluntary self-ID. And again, I know that the surveys are really difficult and can be a real strain on certain diversity departments, but I implore I really encourage firms to invest in the personnel to go through these surveys. as opposed to being resistant to it, because I do think it allows for us to not be data driven, but be data informed. And I think, we're not focused just on the numbers. We're just looking at them to measure, where are we going? Where have we been? Where are we, and where are we trying to go? And I think that was something that was really, we were excited to see that once we did a rehaul of our voluntary self-IDs, we included Middle Eastern and North African as a underrepresented race and ethnicity for people to select. We made sure that people had the options of selecting multiple ethnicities. And so people were not bound to say multiracial or 2 or more races, but they were able to say they were multiracial and select what their racial makeup was. Being able to recognize that someone who selects the ethnicity of Hispanic may identify as Black and or white as well, or just may want to identify as Hispanic. So giving people that option. We, of course, had disability in our voluntary self-ID forms, but we were a little bit more specific and gave more information around the definition so people could read it and think, oh, okay, I did not realize. Select, right? Like this is my experience. I am asthmatic. I have been forever. Like this is my experience. I am going to select it. And being able to, and our veterans as well, we were able to make sure that we were really thoughtful about how we ask those questions, because I think before it was just a little bit too blanket or a little bit too broad. And what that did was allow for our lawyer networks, which are affinity groups, to now capture some of that, what is the makeup of our community, and how can we reflect that now in the offerings that we have in terms of affinity groups. And that has really taken off for us. So we started 3 new affinity groups as a result of that voluntary self-ID redo. We have a Middle East and North African affinity group. We also started a disability awareness affinity group, which is focused on those that identify with a disability, but also those who care, who are caregivers, those who are there to learn as well. And then lastly, we also started a first generation lawyer network, which was, something that I think is much larger and been a real fantastic addition to our affinity groups as well.
How many other affinity groups do you have overall?
Nine total. 9 total. So 6 have been in place for several years.
That's so interesting to learn. Thank you. I know that for some people who may be on this call who are at smaller firms, hearing all this sounds like a lot. And I want to encourage everyone to find one thing you can do to take action in a small way. Not everyone can make the progress that Morgan Lewis has made in this period of time. And your actions still matter. Leila, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about what you're seeing overall from the Diversity Lab in terms of how firms are making progress on tracking and identifying and bringing in inclusion. Really, Morgan Lewis stands out because they're one of 2 that excelled across all areas. What else are you seeing that's really standing out for you?
Well, I would like to hold on Malaika's point about that self-ID campaign and sort of rethinking of the survey. I know you mentioned the wonderful benefits of data. I love data. We love data at Diversity Lab. But I think it's really an inclusion effort too. We tend to sort of separate those things, right? There's self-ID, so you can get the data so you know who's out there. And then there's inclusion, which is your actions. But when you take such a measured and deliberate approach with your self-identification campaign, what you're saying to your lawyers is we care about who you are as an individual. And I love that you really sort of define what it means to be a lawyer with disabilities so that people don't sort of put them in their box. We know a lot of individuals only say, well, I don't need any accommodations, right? So why would I check that box? And starting to separate this identity from just HR and regulatory requirements is a really key inclusive step. And it shows truly in Morgan Lewis's assessment in the Inclusion Blueprint. They really shine when it comes to lawyers with disabilities. They were one of the few firms who hit any of the what we call Inclusion Blueprint benchmarks for lawyers with disabilities, which was having at least 5% lawyers with disabilities in various roles. And my guess is that it's not actually true that other firms don't have those individuals in those positions, but they haven't created an intentional and safe environment for those individuals to identify. So I really think that's we'll start to see, hopefully, more firms take the leadership of Morgan Lewis, but that really shows. And I'm glad you highlighted that, Malaika, because it's just an important step, not only in tracking and measuring and getting the data, but in actually sort of communicating to your lawyers that it's important.
I really think that's such an important piece because I know how difficult it is for people to self-identify. There's almost like this sense that we're not supposed to be different. We're supposed to minimize that. And now we're asking people to show up and accentuate their differences. And it can be a little scary. And then there's a sense of like, gosh, okay, it's a big law firm. Is this confidential? Is it anonymous? Who's using this information? How are they using it? What ramifications will I face? Will this follow me into my next job? What are you hearing about that, Malaika and Leila?
So I will say that, and a question came in too, that, it's hard to get people to participate in the voluntary self-ID. We're very clear on where and how we use the information, and we give folks the opportunity to consent to share the information with clients, consent to share it internally, or that only for the purposes of data, right? Only for the purposes of like aggregate data can we share, can you share my information? And of course, people have the option not to self-identify at all. But what they have, I think what has happened here culturally is that our affinity groups have taken on kind of they are there for resources and support for one another, but they really have taken on to this idea of what I really like to think of as like the cultural feedback loop, right? Like this idea that we've got, who is in our community and making sure that those voices are heard in a way that actually starts to contribute to the fabric, to the cultural fabric of the firm. And so they do the job of alongside our D&I team of educating about experiences, just sharing them. We've had several of our programming around our disability awareness lawyers around, just sharing experiences. And I will say that the partners here the leadership here leads the charge around that. People are open to share their experiences and have been very candid with the firm about what inclusion means when it comes to disability. And I think that folks think automatically about accommodation, which is an HR function, and that happens, right? And folks are bound by law to do particular things, and firms will go above and beyond even what they're required to do. But inclusion is really about, do I have the space to talk about strategies in the way that I manage my disability, to talk about the ways that I care give, the resources, just the community support, to know that someone who's practicing law at the same level that you are experiences some of the same joys, opportunities, challenges when it comes to one thing or another. And that it's nuanced, but it's really important to know I'm not alone. And so what is happening is that as people continue to share, people start to join. People are, oh, but I raised my hand for this and I raised my hand for that. And ultimately, we also have the work of destigmatizing some things that come with practicing law and having a disability. And that is something that we're all working really hard on, especially when it comes to mental health. But we are really kind of focused and thoughtful about what spaces we create so that people can find community. Because ultimately, that's what the networks are here to do for our lawyers and our professional staff.
I think that's right. And I'll just add, lawyers are fast followers. They want to know that it's safe first. And so you get a couple people sharing their experiences, like you said, Malaika, and then it just sort of snowballs. And I also want to talk about sort of the response rate on those self-IDs that someone mentioned. Like you said, Malaika, like it's really the intentionality and the education behind it. So I think I use the word campaign very specifically because that's what we learned actually from some of the legal departments that we work with through the Mansfield rule is they've really had success on getting their lawyers to self-identify by creating a campaign. And actually it's more company-wide because they have all the resources, but it's more company-wide, but really creating a campaign and saying, this is coming. This is why we care about it. This is what could come of it. And that really gets people excited about it, excited about identifying, and then feel safe to do so. And then, you can't just, like with any survey, you can't just put it out there and hope they respond and never follow up, but really give some incentives and some education around it. I think that really starts to help with seeing an increased response rate, because I do know that that's always a challenge with any survey, but particularly one about who you are as a human feels a little reductive to put it on paper. But I think where that intentionality comes through, that really helps.
I absolutely love this sense that when we show up authentically, we have the opportunity to build more community. And there's so much power in that, in the sense of understanding and being able to experience greater growth, really. Fantastic. Malaika, I'm curious, how have you used storytelling as a way to encourage and inspire others in the firm to really lean into the work that you're doing?
Oh, so I think for our lawyer networks, any opportunity we can have for people to share stories firm wide. So what what our remote work has taught us is that we can scale some of the knowledge, right? We can scale some of the storytelling. And instead of requiring things to just be in person, now that we are hybrid and people are back in the office and the office is bustling, we still really utilize the virtual space, because there's no greater way to reach 4,000 people than to be able to just log in during the lunch and hear someone share a story. So during our Heritage Months, we really, during our celebration of Heritage Months, we really do take the time to make sure that we are sharing stories in that. Last year, we did for Black History Month, our lawyers came together to talk about Black exceptionalism and what that means in the law. And it was a nuanced discussion that we were, folks are very concerned, like, can we do this across this many people that are coming from so many different vantage points when it comes to this? But it was handled so delicately and so wonderfully, but it was really folks sharing their experiences of, when you are excellent at what you do and happen to be Black, right? Are you then the exception to Blackness? And that was the discussion. And this idea that, we think of excellence and we like to hold up, figures in our communities that are doing excellent work. What are the stereotypes that we are either combating, or what are things that we should be talking about when it comes to how certain underrepresented groups in the organization may be experienced, and for people to share that and what that means when you practice law. And we had folks who were some of our professional staff as well, just sharing their experiences, kind of navigating the industry and what that looks like. And really, ultimately, what happens in those settings is people say, oh, and I have experienced that, or I've experienced something similar, or I did not realize that that is what maybe a colleague of mine experiences. And that, I think, is part of, we use storytelling to really kind of bridge the gap, which I think that, to show that we are a lot more alike than we might expect, but also to recognize some of the stereotypes or biases that our colleagues may be overcoming in order to show up every day. And how do we become a community or a workplace that recognizes and doesn't overburden folks, who may be experiencing those things, right? How do we make sure that we even the playing field as much as possible, even when it comes to connecting and networking, the simple things, being mindful of that as we are developing relationships, because ultimately, as much as we have lecture style learning and development, at the end of the day, our attorneys are practicing, and they learn through practice. And the vehicle for that are the relationships they develop. And if we can't figure out a way to build help people make sure that they're building relationships, then we're not helping their professional development. And so part of what we're doing is making, right, the barrier to entry to build the relationship as low as possible. We're going to make sure that we're accentuating what are the differences, but what are the ways that you can find commonality in order to build those relationships, because it's key to their skill development.
I love that completely, Malaika. This is such a common situation where if something happens to 100,000 people, it's a blur. But if something happens to one person, it's personal. And what if that one person is your friend? And so when you can say like, oh, I don't understand this, but then you meet one person who shares an experience with you, it finally resonates, then you get it.
Yeah.
And then you see, oh, I could make a difference. I could change my actions, behaviors, thoughts, words. I could show up differently. I could advocate for this person.
And ultimately, I will go back to some of the questions that we get on surveys. The dividend survey is one of them I'm thinking about. But one of the things that happens is, what is the structure that's in place to make sure what you just said, Monica, is happening? So we can still kind of make sure that we are, when you're filling out your evaluation, what are the things that we value? What are the questions that actually get people to think about how inclusive they're being, how they're showing up for others? Our partners are evaluated, they evaluate their colleagues, right? They share what ways in which that they've collaborated with others. Like, so, yes, it's one thing to say we collaborate and we love collaboration, but what are the mechanisms that we actually hold people to making sure that our culture reflects that? And our evaluation systems, the way that we do our self-assessments, what we incentivize in terms of pro bono work, in terms of even we have the D&I billable credit, which we're very excited to be able to say that was put in place as a, all of that is, yes, we want people to do this work, but we're also going to make an investment that and demonstrate that it is valued and it is part of your skill development, which I couldn't ask for anything more.
Well, this is super important to me, as I think one of the things that matters most in law firms, I may be wrong, but I think it's probably money. How am I getting paid? And billable hours. So how does that show up in your measurement? And how do you actually, is it compensation? Is it something else? How do you encourage and incentivize this behavior?
I mean, ultimately, I think it is the systems that we have, or the ways that we evaluate ourselves, our talent strategy model, collaboration, engagement, those things are at the forefront, but we are very intentional about what that actually means. So making sure that people understand when we say collaboration, like for instance, myself, I'm asked, what departments are you working with? How does that work? Am I asking for evaluators from other departments to evaluate me? Right, to demonstrate that we are actually doing some of that work, because I think collaboration is also the concept of inclusion, and I think that we can call things different names, but all we're trying to do when we say how are we measuring inclusion, right, is not just are we telling you to do something, but do we also provide you with the tools in order to do it? So are we providing the firm with inclusive leadership, right? And inclusive leadership is a fancy way of basically saying, have you organized the way that you're going to approach your team in a way that sets out expectations and is measurable, right? So what are we doing there? How are we organized? And that is going to be reflected not just in the way that you might assess yourself, because we do ask those questions in self-assessments, but it's also going to be reflected in upward feedback, how your team assesses you. And so being able to have a culture where you're trying to also pick talent that buys into those values, we also try to hold people to it in the way that they are evaluated and compensated. I think that we've been very clear in terms of, excellent client service requires people to have great professional development opportunities. And we believe that comes in the form of client work, but it also comes in the form of pro bono work. We have unlimited pro bono hours here at the firm. Everybody, 100% of the lawyers here will do pro bono work each year. They at least make 20 hours. Several of them are over 20 hours per year. That is, I think, an extent or a reflection of what we value here at the firm, in terms of, the work that we do will benefit our clients, and we should also benefit those that are not in the same positions as us and that we could give back to our communities in. And then we have the D&I billable credit, which is billable hours credit for doing active D&I work. And you can't, I've heard a lot of folks who have the D&I billable credit, and one of the things that they've complained with the most is that it's very limited, right? Like, oh, there's only a few things that actually count. Or, I attended a meeting where we heard from the Asian American Lawyer Network, but I didn't, I got credit for that, but I'm not quite sure what I'm doing that's helpful here. We think of it as active participation in the firm's D&I efforts, but we have lots of spaces where the firm is heavily invested in order for people to jump in and help. Mobilizing for Equality that I mentioned earlier is one of them. Our lawyer networks are open to those that identify as well as allies. So getting people to come in and raise their hand and collectively do some of the work that sometimes falls to the underrepresented communities that are, already kind of walking through their career at, as an from an underrepresented group. We don't want to place all of that work on that community. We want everybody to participate, with the hopes that we are giving folks the opportunity to engage in D&I work so that it becomes a part of the way in which they work generally, as opposed to just something that they do every now and then as an activity.
So it's also fantastic, Malaika. I want to ask a quick question from the chat. Melissa Andreu from Dorf and Nelson asks, what advice would you give to a mid-sized firm on how to approach the subject of self-identifying? And maybe both of you could weigh in on how you allow mid-sized firms to be part of this. Leila and Malaika, any advice you might have for maybe one thing, right? Because you're doing so much, but for a smaller scale firm, what are the things that you think could stand out the most in self-identifying?
Leila, I'll let you chime in here. I know you've heard a lot from.
I was just going to say, I'm a master in throwing the question back at the question asker, so I'm going to do that. But I'm curious what the challenge is. Is it limited resources internally at a smaller firm? Is it fear of actual individual identification because it's such a small group of lawyers? I think Melissa could come off mute if that's allowed. I'm just curious what the challenge is for the smaller and mid-sized firms.
Both of those. Both. And I think maybe a fear of, why are you asking me this question? Isn't it evident? Because it's something new that we will be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think that's where the education piece that Malaika was talking about really comes into play, right? You would say, this is important to us. You don't want to say this, but the sort of underlying tone is, look, we can profile everyone, but we don't know who you are underneath, right? And the goal is not to profile. The goal is to identify you as you identify. There are, I think there are a lot of individuals who you look at them and it's not obvious how they might identify from a racial or ethnic identity, from a gender identity, and certainly from LGBTQ plus and individuals with disabilities. So I think you have to educate a little bit around that. And then what I think learn from Malaika, right? I think one of the keys to some of that D&I fatigue or self-identity fatigue is that it feels like it goes into a void and nothing happens with it. So really saying up front what you're going to do with this information, why it's important to the firm. And this is both on the sharing level, like Malaika talked about, right? Specifically choosing how you want to share your information, whether you want to share your information, but also what are we going to do from an action-oriented perspective? Is this going to help us do a pay equity audit so that we can identify any pay gaps? Then I bet you'll get a good response, right? But really explaining why this is important into how the firm operates and is structured. And I lean on Malaika because she's on the ground doing the work.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's That's exactly right. I will also say that one advantage a mid or small size firm has is that you don't have to limit it to your lawyers. And if you can step away from offering employee resource groups or affinity groups across the board and get them active. People want to join things that are active. Yes, there are professional development, business development, client engagement related topics that your lawyers are going to need to be able to discuss or participate in when it comes to those affinity groups. But in general, part of the self-ID process is it's going to, for the benefit of X, Y, or Z. And we actually use our affinity groups to educate on the self-ID. So people will show up who have not self-identified at all. And once they're there, we talk about it, right? What does it mean to identify as Mina? Mina was a big one where no one really was self-identifying. We had several people selecting other because they didn't feel comfortable using the census designation, which was white. You had others who had been selecting white for all of their adult life. And so now join this group and they're like, oh, I don't have to select that anymore. I can select something else if I'd like. And so we use the actual affinity groups because once you call people out to, hey, come and join, we're going to do, come together to give support and guidance. Once there, then you can start to educate on the self-ID process and why, it is an option that folks should consider doing so that we can call on folks when we think that it's necessary. I'm sure several people on this call, every employer wanted to be able to reach out to their Black employees to say after the murder of George Floyd during that summer, and how many folks could actually do it on a dime. Right. And it was really difficult for a lot of firms, a lot of organizations to be able to do that. And, now that people, understand that space was really needed in the workplace, those affinity groups that were well positioned to kind of address that, I think really made an impact in terms of how people managed and worked through that, really, really intense summer.
Malaika, Morgan Lewis is doing so much more than mobilizing for equality too. And a couple of the programs I'm really impressed with is one, there's the Diverse Associate Sponsorship Programs and the IP Practice Initiative Diversity Career Progression Initiative. How are you measuring the impact of those programs?
We're able to put those programs in place. Our diversity and inclusion committee is made up, it's chaired by Jamie, and the members of the committee are actually members of the practice group leadership. And so we have we call it a diversity and inclusion practice group diversity and inclusion practice group liaison. And that person is a part of leadership within that practice group, because what we recognize is that being able to actually think about D&I or inclusive practices and the advancement and promotion of folks within who identify as an underrepresented group, the only way to really do that effectively is by practice group. And so we do kind of global, firm-wide or the affinity groups and that kind of stuff. But when we start looking at development and advancement, we're looking at the practice group. And so we have liaisons that report into the committee. And those liaisons during our committee is actually the one that that works through our sponsorship program, and our IP team has a talent cultivation program. And that each practice group went through and said, what are the areas in which we need to be focused on when it comes to our inclusive practices, our diversity recruiting, et cetera. So the IP team looked at their recruiting strategies, changed a lot of their recruiting strategies, are more pipeline focused. And of course, as a result, comes up with a strategy, is able to work with our diversity recruiting manager, but alongside.
I think Malaika lost her connection, so maybe she'll be back with us in a minute, hopefully. Another program that
Only
Morgan
5
Lewis,
minutes left and not 35 minutes left.
I'm sure she'll be back soon. Another program Morgan Lewis does is they give more than a dozen $40,000 grants to low-income law students. And I can't speak for the firm, but I think this commitment is outstanding and really plays into what Malaika was talking about in terms of recruitment and how you can shift this recruitment. Here she comes again. Shift the recruitment from focus on the top 10 law schools to expand what is financially accessible for low-income students. And we've got her back now. Welcome back, Malaika.
Always have a backup ready.
That's right. That's right.
So I'm on another device, but we can keep going.
I love it.
So yeah, our essentially our diversity and inclusion liaisons really do kind of manage making sure that they are in touch with leadership of the practice group and are keeping an eye on and keeping front of mind the progression of those that are from underrepresented groups. And that allows for us to think about everybody here at the firm, each practice groups has a mentorship program that is firm-wide resourced very well to make sure that people, as they come into the firm in particular, whether that's at an entry level or lateral, have someone to go to just how to navigate the practice, right? How they're moving through, making sure that they understand the expectations of the practice group, those kind of things. Then we go on to sponsorship, where we are really thinking about looking at our talent pool. How are we making sure that opportunities in order to get the advancement, right? In order to make sure that people are on track to get the skill development that will put them in the best position for advancement within the practice. And that is something that we have been doing through each practice group has, taken a look and been very mindful about where they need to focus, what year they need to focus, right? Which is different across each practice group and different across the board. So they take ownership in being able to really understand. And what happens in that process is that you start to get the practice group they're very mindful of what are the expectations, because transparency around expectations and skill development and where folks should be is something that for people who are first generation lawyers can be really difficult to understand, especially when you're in a hybrid work environment, making sure that people have the expectations set forth for them and where that is clear and concise and gives people opportunities to engage and to participate. And those folks who are in those roles are making sure that that gets done across, all of their populations. And then we also have a firm-wide sponsorship program, which is really thinking about those that are on the path to promotion. They are, literally, they are in the position where partnership is in sight. We have someone from the advisory committee sponsor them. And that changes, now we start to create some transparency about not just what it means to make partner, but now thinking about what it is to build a practice. And what does that look like? And so we have some of our, folks in leadership who have built fantastic practices, have led practice groups, sponsor and, really look after those associates who are on that cusp and to get them to kind of widen their view as to what partnership looks like at the firm, the support and resources that they should be looking to kind of start to utilize and really start to think about the shift, I think, in their frame of mind when it comes to what partnership will look like. These are all the little things that if you've built the right relationships, right? Or if you've built the relationships in the firm, those things come to you, right? You get someone who takes you under your wing and they tell you those things. And we encourage that generally, but we still have to put structures in place that make sure that no one is left through the cracks.
There are so many questions I want to ask you, Malaika, but I'll end with one. You have some really ambitious goals for 2025. I would love to hear more about that in our next conversation because we don't have time to address all of that. but I know it's really hard, and I would love to hear what has been personally most rewarding for you.
You know, I know that a lot of folks who are on this call do D&I work. I'll just share very quickly. I started practicing. I've always been, I started practicing in 2009. I've always been really curious about how to navigate spaces. I've always known that I needed something, it wasn't enough to just be smart. There was something else that was going on. Didn't quite know. People are calling it a network. I'm like, what does that mean? I'm first generation American. My parents are from Tanzania. And so I've always been really curious, what it was. And in the law firm space, I found it to be the most opaque. It was really difficult for me to understand what the expectations were. It was really difficult for me to really gauge how to kind of navigate and be successful and get the feedback that I was doing well or doing poorly, and how can I navigate that? And I had a practice group leader really just take, eventually I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. So he shared with me and we ended up creating a really wonderful relationship. But I recognized that I was one that had that relationship. And that just never sat well with me, that my peers who were women, who were people of color, just didn't necessarily have that type of relationship. And that relationship allowed for me to determine whether I wanted to continue practicing or not, because it was very clear what practice was going to be for me and how I would incorporate that in my life. And I knew then, well, I don't know if I want to do this, but I stayed for 7 years. Because I felt an obligation to constantly share, right? And just share with everyone that I knew. And so I really am happy to be amongst other D&I professionals who do this work on a day-to-day basis. I thank you all because, I would have loved to have had someone like me at the firm when I was practicing. So I think that I'm really excited that organizations, firms are putting folks in D&I in place, because, it took a lot of work, a lot of community to bring me to where I was when I started practicing, and for the organization to make sure that there were things in place so that people like me don't fall through the cracks, that don't think that this is for them just because they haven't made the right relationship. And so I'm really proud for Morgan Lewis, really kind of putting their investment where their values are. And, I work with really fantastic people who care deeply in general about the people here, and as a result about D&I. So, that kind of keeps me going. So for everyone out there, onward, take your breaks, but, it really does make a difference.
I appreciate how much work it is, and inspired by what you and Morgan Lewis have accomplished. And I appreciate our partnership with Diversity Lab. And thank you so much, Leila, for being here to share your remarks. And for all of you for showing up. Our next DEIB webinar series will be on March 15th at 11 a.m. Pacific. Next week on January 26th, we have an accelerator series at 9:30 a.m. January 26th. So go to chipsnetwork.org, check out our events, sign up. Be part of the conversation of advancing women in tech law and policy. Thank you, Joan Toth, for leading this organization to these conversations. And thank you to all of the CHIPS staff for being here. I see Jen Hagan, Bridget Johnson, Virginia Moore. And thank you for Melissa for your question. And please, reach out, be part of the conversation, and continue to meet us in this space where we can do more together and make the things that we don't think are possible actually possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.